Hello friends, welcome to yet another session on essay perspectives. The topic for today is if voting really made difference, they would not let us do it. So since this is election season, I thought of taking a topic on voting. As always, I have a personal request friends. Third edition of my book Ethics, Integrity and Aptitude has unfortunately been pirated. Pirated copies are of very low paper and print quality. I urge all of you to buy original. Original copies can be bought by scanning the QR code on the screen or by clicking on the link given in the slide. Now friends, as always, every essay has to be first conceptualized as being made of various components and subcomponents. So first we would introduce the topic, then we would delve deep upon the essence of the topic, then we would discuss the limitations of voting, then merits of voting, then the conditions that would make voting work, and then we would conclude. Friends, as soon as I saw this topic, I was reminded of Pakistani elections that concluded recently. As all of us are aware, these elections were known for a lot of irregularities. Just before elections, the party led by Imran Khan, Tehreek-e-Insaf, was disqualified from contesting the elections. But however, Imran Khan backed supporters. They went ahead, they marched ahead, and they decided to contest as independents in most of the constituencies. Yet, then in most of the places they were not allowed to file nominations, so they had to face a lot of violence while they went for campaigning. So a lot of unethical, irregular things transpired. Yet surprisingly, all the independents backed by Pakistani Tehreek-e-Insaf (PTI), they emerged out as a major group. We cannot call them victorious because they were not officially represented by a party. Thus, they could not be called a majority party, and then that would allow them to form government. That aside, but they made a significant impact. They were a major power to reckon with. But yet, finally, they could not form the government. So here, there are two aspects which we have to specifically focus. One is that how Imran Khan's party was not allowed to contest elections, or how obstacles were created for that party in having a level playing field in the elections. Correct? So thus this vitiates, this neutralizes the impact of voting. This would make us feel that voting would not make much of a difference. But finally, despite all those obstacles, that group only emerged victorious, or that group emerged to be the single largest cohort or single largest group. So they could somehow come out victorious, even despite they were not being allowed to contest on a party ticket, despite them not being allowed to campaign freely, despite them not being allowed to have their due share of fair electoral treatment, if I may say so. Correct? So but they emerged out, they became victorious. Correct? So thus these are the two contrasting things. If voting really made much, the obstacles created to them, the disqualification would convince us that voting does not matter, because but however, they despite those shortcomings, them coming out to be the single majority group makes us convinced that voting does matter. Correct? So thus it is this essay seeks to examine whether voting really matter. So friends, we have to delve deep into the essence of the topic. So there are many key terms. First is voting. Voting, as it is self-explanatory. So voting implies casting preferences at elections in order to elect a representative who would which in turn would lead to the formation of government. This is the simplistic way in which you can define voting. Correct? It is basically casting of preferences to select or elect your representative at the legislature, okay, periodically. Then what does it mean by making a difference? See here, the topic says if voting really made a difference, they would not let us do it. Correct? That means here making a difference would mean that voting having any bearing on the final outcome of formation of government. Correct? So making a difference implies formation of government or running of government. Then they means vested interests. So people who want to appropriate powers to themselves, people who think that ensuring that a particular person or a particular party, particular organization would wield power would help better or advance their own self-interest, such vested interests are what we call they would not let us do it. It actually implies that such vested interest would sabotage the entire voting process. Correct? So let us bring all these things together. So that would actually mean vested interests would not allow the elections to happen if such elections would throw up the results that are against to their self-interests. To rephrase, since elections would not lead to a government that would sabotage their own interests, vested interests have allowed the elections to have let the elections happen. So conversely, it essentially means since elections or not having elections would finally lead to the promotion of vested interests, so vested interests have allowed it. Thus, voting does not matter. If voting were to matter, vested interest would have ensured that voting doesn't take place. Correct? So, basically the one line meaning of this essay statement is that voting has not much role to play in deciding the fate of government or in deciding the policies of the government. It has two dimensions. One is formation of government and formation of policies of the government. So voting does not matter. So that's why vested interest would have allowed. Vested interest have allowed the voting to happen. This essay seeks to examine whether voting is such useless process or not, or such inefficacious process or not. Okay, so after we have understood the essence of the topic, so the topic essentially says voting does not matter. You can sabotage that process. That's why vested interests have allowed it. So first we have to support that argument. First we have to concentrate on the limitations of voting. So the first one is majority syndrome. So the voting is crippled with something called majority syndrome. So whoever gets the majority of the votes would get elected. So it is not necessary that every citizen or every citizen's vote matters. If majority of the people decide to do something, and that will happen in voting. So thus the first and foremost limitation is majority syndromes. So thus if this vested interests represent the interests of the majority, then the what is wrong? So then let voting happen. Correct? So thus the interests of minorities mostly may get compromised. So the first and foremost limitation of voting is majority syndrome. Second, lack of level playing field. See, in voting, every party that contests does not have level playing field. Similarly, every candidate who contests do not have level playing field. Why? Because election is replete with lot of expenditure, lot of influence. So you should be able to spend money, you should be able to have your own organization till the level of every election booth in order to reach to every elector, in order to reach every citizen. If you are not in a position, if you do not have money or organizational power to this extent, then there is no level playing field. So though on paper you may be allowed to contest elections, but while executing the election strategies, there is no level playing field. Also, in many cases, that level playing field gets disturbed by the very conduct of elections by the election commissions. The best example is Pakistani elections, which I already quoted, wherein all the candidates of one particular party were disqualified. So, and if election machinery, or if the election commission or whoever election machinery, if they start enforcing election rules differently to two different persons, then the level playing field is lost. So thus it is presumed that vested interests can control the election conducting organization and can ensure that level playing field is disturbed, and thus only those in parties, candidates whom this vested interest want to win, they would only win. Third, money power. As all of us are aware, election is filled with a lot of expenditure. So you should, it's a huge canvas, huge expanse, huge area where every candidate has to go reach out to the public. So reaching out to the public involves a lot of money. So you have to spend on advertisements, you have to spend on pamphlets, you have to spend on people who would go house to house to convey your ideas, convey your ideologies, convey your thoughts to the people. So it is filled with a lot of expenditure. So thus a person who does not have money would not be in a position to compete at all. So this is another main limitation. So thus this would restrict the feasibility of contesting elections and getting elected in the elections only to certain sections of society who are bestowed with the money power. Then comes muscle power. Just as money power, muscle power also plays a critical role. So this is especially true in areas where there is a feudal system existing or persisting. In many feudal societies, there would always be one head whom you call zamindar, whom you call village headman, whatever you call. So this fellow, by virtue of appropriating huge swaths of land or huge by appropriating the livelihood sources, land may be one such thing. So maybe in a society where animal husbandry is the norm, then he would be having more number of cows, whatever. So thus a person who has appropriated more sources of wealth or more livelihood opportunities, more sources of livelihoods, so would have wielded some amount of psychological and also physical power or superiority influence over the members of that community. So in such scenario, he or she would essentially use that to threaten the public to vote in a particular forum. So also there is another dimension to it. Those people who are very vulnerable, though that means destitute, that means the poor, needy, who don't have their own means of livelihood, so they are always dependent on someone else, so they don't have a voice of their own, would be so diffident in their attitude that if somebody comes and threatens them, they have no power to fight back and they succumb to those threats. So in such scenario, by under threats, under some influence, so they are forced to vote in favor of a particular person. So that would lead to the vitiation of the entire voting process. So then comes rejection. So what do I mean by rejection? See, in the world over, the voting election happens in such a way that the voters have to elect a particular candidate who is contesting the election. What if the candidates, who are contesting, not even a single one of the candidate is found to be worthful to the voters. Do they really have a choice to reject all the candidates so that the election would stop and the parties have to field an altogether new set of candidates? Such systems hardly exist anywhere in the world. So thus the scope of expressing their opinion, the scope of voting gets restricted only to those candidates who are candidates or parties who are contesting the elections. If the voter does not have a scope beyond those who are contesting to ensure that the right government gets formed and right policies through such right government would get formulated in future, correct? Then misinformation. See friends, unfortunately, when will voting becomes fruitful, worthwhile? Only when the electorate, that means citizens, have crystal clear cut information about the parties or candidates contesting the elections, correct? So when you know the true information, then you would ideally weigh the pros and cons of every candidate, every party, and you would decide whom to vote for, whom not to vote for, correct? But such clear information itself is lacking. There is lot of misinformation circulating. So in such a scenario, there are false propaganda, misinformation about a candidate, about a political party would lead to misleading the voters in exercising the right choice. Then undue influence. See, undue influence implies so distribution of liquor, distribution of money, so influencing the voters through unscrupulous means to vote in favor of a particular party. So thus when the vested interests are sure that they can buy votes either through cash or kind or liquor, then they would say, let voting happen, we would buy and ensure the results of our choice. Then electoral malpractices. So there is a lot of scope for electoral malpractices. So even the recently concluded Russian elections where Putin is elected back with resounding majority has raised a lot of questions about the authenticity of the election itself, correct? So there are so many electoral practices like malpractices like rigging, etc., where the electoral process itself is designed in such a way that only a particular candidate or a particular political party gets selected or elected. So thus electoral malpractices, thus the mere scope for electoral malpractices would dilute the spirit of voting. Last, control over voting. So even if you assume that the voting happens fairly, freely, no muscle power, no money power, no misinformation, etc., but the next obvious question is there, basically what is the whole objective of voting? Voting objective is not just the formation of the right government. It extends beyond that. It essentially also means ensuring that the right policies, people-friendly policies are formed by that government after election. So here, even if you assume that the voting happens without any of these malices, yet once the government gets elected, the control that these public have on that government is very, very, very minimal. So in such a scenario, how does voting matter? So the vested interest would allow elections to happen. Once elections happen and a particular government gets elected, they would try to manage at the level of the government and ensure that the policies that are favorable to them get formulated. After this elaborate discussion, we would think that this voting is waste. It is nothing. I mean, we really don't need voting. I mean, it doesn't help at all. But it should not lead us to such disappointing conclusions. Voting does matter. What are the merits of voting? The first one is holding government accountable. See, voting is the only mechanism through which public will be able to hold the government accountable. Whatever government does today, tomorrow it has to answer to the public. If it does not answer to the public, then the public have every right to dislodge that government and bring into being a new government of their choice. So, thus, in order to increase their prospects of getting back to the power, so the governments would seek to work in those ways that are people friendly. So, thus, voting is the only way. If there were to be no voting, then the governments would have a field day. They would follow the policies of their choice, and that would lead to a lot of chaos. Then expression of public opinion. See, normally every political party that contests elections represents a particular ideology. One political party may represent capitalism. One political party may represent socialism. One political party may be rightist in its approach. Another political party may be leftist in its approach. So thus every political party represents a particular political ideology. So thus it is only through voting, thus voting provides the right forum for expression of public opinion. That means whether public are in favor of capitalist government or they are in favor of socialist government, whether public are in favor of rightist approach or centrist approach or leftist approach. So if not for voting, this pulse of the public would not get reflected anywhere. If this pulse does not get reflected, then the government that is in the being would formulate those policies which are anti-people. Then ground for public discourse. Friends, think over it. Only during elections, it is only for elections the opposition parties attack the government. Ruling parties rebut the allegations. So this election, pre-run to election, is a fertile ground for public discourse. Every decision of the government, every policy of the government is subjected to strict scrutiny by the public. Is subjected to the strict scrutiny by the opposition party. That means, so every policy is openly criticized. Whatever the criticisms leveled, the ruling party would give its own rebuttal. Finally, both the parties, it would be a scenario of argument and counter argument leading to a judgment. So this would help public develop their understanding of public policies, the nuances of public policies, and also the pros and cons of the government policies that were already formulated, and also those policies that are promised to be implemented or promised to be formulated. So it is only election that gives a scope for such public discourse. If not for elections, nobody would have cared to speak for the government or against the government. So keeping the public in the dark, public would have continued to remain ignorant. Then keeps government on toes. Friends, if not for elections, if not for voting, the governments would embrace a lackadaisical approach and they would not be on their toes to implement government programs, to implement the developmental projects in mission mode. All governments in power would want to finish a few developmental projects and tell the electorate that you people voted us to power, so we have finished these many developmental projects in such a short span. Please elect us back again. We would complete these projects again. If not for this, then the government would not care to complete the projects well in time, so leading to cost overruns, time overruns, and finally neutralizing the benefits that are supposed to accrue from such projects. So it is only elections that would keep the government on its toes. Then minorities factor. Friends, this may sound counterintuitive. Initially I said that the first limitation of elections voting which I told is majority syndrome, correct? But however, interestingly, counterintuitively, this voting gives lot of scope for minorities also. How does it? Friends, finally in most of the elections, so the majority should be voting in for a particular dispensation. So if there are two majority communities, they would vote in a certain fashion, correct? In such a scenario, these minorities would become decisive factor. Whoever minorities vote for would become victorious. So let us say there are three communities. Two communities represent 40% of population. Third community represents only or 20% of the population. In such a scenario, there are this majority parties. A community would vote for A political party, B community would vote for B political party. So then both the parties would have 40% vote share. Then whoever this minorities vote, then they would get 60% of vote share and they would become victorious. So thus minorities factor, it is a very interesting arrangement that elections make minorities also decisive in most of the cases. So thus it is important, thus elections matter, elections are essential. Now friends, we have discussed in detail about the limitations of voting. We have also discussed about the merits of voting. Now the most ideal thing would be that we should be able to, we cannot set aside the voting process altogether, but we should come up with some processes that would address the malaise of voting, so that voting matters, so voting becomes important. What are those ideal conditions, such processes that would make voting work? The first thing is independent election commission. If an independent election commission is constituted, if the election commission is truly independent, then the electoral process would be foolproof, would be fair, would be impartial, as in the case of India. India has always witnessed a smooth transition of power. Nowhere in the world would you see such a smooth transition of power. Nowhere in the world would you see such fair and impartial conduct of elections. So why is that possible? That is possible only because of independent election commissions. Election commission is backed by constitution. It is not under the control of government. So election commission acts freely, fairly, and election commission in India has been successful in developing processes that would make election fair and impartial. Then independent judiciary. Just like election commission, an independent judiciary is also important, because any election related offences, complaints has to be adjudicated by judiciary. If the judiciary is fair, independent, then the elections also would be fair and independent, and that would actually, there would be check on the malpractices being there would be check on the likely malpractices that are likely to be committed by election commissions. Then independent media should not be state sponsored. Media should be independent. Free media plays a critical role in forming right public opinion. If the media is controlled by the state, then filtered information would be propagated to the public, leading to skewed public opinions. So this problem is addressed through free media. Then state funding of elections. As I told you, this money power is the most nonsensical thing in elections. So thus it also discourages people, good people, discourages efficient people with no money power to come forward and contest in elections. So that problem can be addressed through state funding of elections. So the expenditure for elections by any political party would be funded by from the state exchequer. Then rejection and recall. I told you, as we already discussed, so the two major drawbacks with the voting process is that the voters are constrained to only elect from the list of candidates who are contesting the elections. So there are a few countries, or there is a democratic process called rejection, wherein if the voters think that none of the candidates contesting is worthwhile, then they can reject the entire list. So then the parties would be forced to field new candidates. Maybe to make the concept clear, let us say in the Indian context, you have nota, right? None of the above. If the nota votes are more than the winning margin, in such a scenario the entire election has to be conducted afresh. Of course this provision is not there in India, but this is one way in which that provision of rejection can be incorporated in Indian context. Then comes recall. By recall is meant once the government is elected to the power, the voters have very little minimal control over the formation of or formulation of government policies. By recall is meant if the public are not happy about the performance of a particular government, then they can recall the government midway before the completion of the term of the government. Then multi-party system. Yeah, this is a very simple thing, self-explanatory thing. So that means there should be multi-party system. Anybody who wants to float a party should be able to float a political party. So there is multi-party system. That means there should be scope and opportunity for every organization, every citizen. Then independent candidates. Even those candidates who think their individual ideologies are not adequately represented by any political party, then they should have the scope and provision to attend elections. Next, mandatory disclosures. So there should be a provision to disclose the assets and criminal antecedents of the candidates contesting in elections. So such mandatory disclosures would enable the public to gauge the amount of money we would gauge the scope, the antecedents of the candidates, and they would be able to make the right decision. Then reservation. Friends, it is very interesting. See, if not for reservation, some communities may not get represented in the legislature at all. So in order to ensure that minorities also get due representation, so reservation is brought into force. In India, reservations in terms of SC reserved constituencies, ST reserved constituencies is the need of is one mechanism through which the even SCs, STs also get represented, adequate due representation in the legislature. So then after this elaborate discussion, it is time for conclusion, friends. So from the above discussion, we can safely conclude that though voting has its own limitations, but of all the other systems, the voting is the best available system. So the system can be made better by addressing all the malaise, all the limitations through the mechanisms which are explained just now. Okay friends, so thank you. So let us meet next week with another topic. So thank you, all the best, happy reading.